and welcome to our knowledge transfer series. Today we're going to talk about creating a growth bucket focused on retirement. So this is a little different than talking about just general investing. So we're going to talk about, this is part of a 3-bucket model we use in our practice, which is income, protection, and then growth, which is what we're going to talk about today. Just real briefly, my name is John Erickson. I have over 17 years experience in the financial services industry, and creating these videos and trying to spread the knowledge I've gathered throughout my career is a passion project of mine. I really enjoy doing that, so I hope you enjoy this video. As I give this presentation, I always mention that today's information has to be treated as general in nature. Even though I'm going to try and be as specific as I can and, try and give really helpful information, everyone's situation could be slightly different. So we always treat these presentations as general. So what we're talking about today, when we talk about creating a growth bucket, we need to understand some of the problems of figuring out what is a growth bucket. And then we have to talk about the concept of the S&P 500 or index funds in general. We want to talk about the idea of identifying your core holdings. And then we'll talk about briefly how we handle this in our practice. So what is a growth bucket in retirement? I always say that retirement typically is dominated by a concept we call core holdings. Today I can go invest generally. I can take $1 and try and grow it to $10, right? You have some big explosive event. But in retirement, what you typically are trying to do is you're trying to identify things called core holdings, things that have long-term predictable growth that's not necessarily guaranteed, but has a long-term track record of not just explosive events, but consistency. And that idea of a core holding, if you understand that that's what a lot of the retirement services industry is trying to do, 2 or 4 retirees, you can kind of start to figure for yourself, should I fit into this bucket or not? And you really want to talk about it, look at this concept right here and this basic problem of, and when we talk about growth bucket, how diversified are you? Because going left to right, we have fairly diversified investments on the left that would have worse returns than, say, a single stock like Microsoft that has long-term predictable returns, versus another Vanguard fund. And so when we kind of go through this mix right here, one of the problems we have with the growth bucket is the more you diversify can really affect what your returns are going to be. And the other problem we talk about growth bucket versus, say, general investing, and we're really focused on retirees, we're really trying to control 2 big emotions, fear and greed. And I always add taxes to it because taxes is one of those things that really triggers one of those 2 emotions, actually. And really, when we talk about a growth bucket, we have 2 sides of the equation that we watch out for. The concept that things can't go up forever. Is that true? And then the concept of, my portfolio is only going up a number like 20% and someone else made 200%. And I really want that bigger number. It's FOMO, right? And so there's a lot of psychological and behavioral influences that affect the financial services industry. It affects growth buckets. It affects financial professionals like myself. And you have to understand that this is a problem when we try and identify what these growth buckets are. And so because we have these basic problems, right? What are you going to choose around your diversification strategy? What are you going to choose around your emotional strategy? We need to create a process. I'm a financial planner, so I like process. And this is a process I create for myself to identify growth buckets and try and give my clients benchmarking. And I would suggest you consider copying it. And I think the most important thing is estimating a potential rate of return for your growth bucket. Then once you do that, understand what the risk is or volatility. Is this considered a core position? That's a really important concept for retirees. And then, there's some secondary factors I look at: passive taxation, liquidity, and just general failure statistics. And so if you can create a process for yourself at identifying this growth bucket, you might have a more well-rounded approach to this. So let's talk about this process when we talk about index funds. And index funds, especially because they oftentimes fit very well as core holdings, are one of the really kind of the bedrocks for a growth bucket a lot of times. And so let's start with a basic concept. An S&P 500 index fund, SPY, right? Not guaranteed, but over the last 10 years has earned over 12%. Has a risk score that's actually slightly under market returns at 72, total market returns. This is considered a core holding. It has a certain amount of passive taxation that goes along with it typically. It's very liquid. It's an ETF. And you're going to have general market risk and overweighting risk with a fund like this. And this is a good baseline to look at. And when you look at this, you got to kind of start with this baseline and go, well, what else can I do? What am I giving up? What are my choices around this? And you might look at a classical one, something tied to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. So I use another SPDR fund for that. And you'll notice this is slightly worse returns, slightly different standard deviation. Slightly different passive taxation, but still fairly similar. We'd still consider this a core holding. And you may have this basic problem that I have, which is better. And which is better when we compare it to a more growth-oriented core holding fund. And this is Invesco's QQQ, and this has an 18% return over 10 years, right? Well, not guaranteed to continue. It has a higher standard deviation, so it's a little bit more risky, but not massively so. It's still considered a core holding, and it's definitely overweighted towards tech. But now we have an even new wrinkle to the risk. We have the S&P 500. We have something maybe a little less risky, the S&P 500, with a little less return. And we have something that might be a little bit more risky, the S&P 500, but significantly more returns. Now, and what about if we compare this to an option that a lot of retirees look at, which is like a standard freedom fund, right? So this is Fidelity's Freedom Fund 2035. It's a very common fund I'm going to run into. And, on a 10-year return, you're typically averaging about 8%. And once again, when you look at this would also fit the growth bucket. And it's going to have a lower standard deviation, typically a lower risk score. And once again, when you start to look at this basic concept of index funds and how do you start to diversify this and blend this together, you have lots of great options. But I find the blending of this is the challenge of the growth fund, not identifying a basic core holding. And so we have to understand this role of risk tolerance and blending this process. It's a big issue in my industry. It's a big issue for compliance. Understanding, what could happen. Because if you take $1 of something and you invest it, you have two things that typically occur. You have different return characteristics, and you also typically have different risk characteristics. And one of the things that can be challenging about a growth bucket is the idea of, I don't want any risk, but I want great returns. You typically can't do that. The devil's always in the blending of this. And if you compare American Funds Balanced versus Vanguard's Life Strategy Growth Fund versus just blending QQQ and DIA, you're going to have somewhat similar risk scores in some of these situations and way different rates of return characteristics, right? This is one of the challenges of identifying a growth position. And there are challenges around your risk tolerances. What if you expect certain rates of return versus certain risk? What if your financial plan says you can take more risk and you really don't want to potentially lose 30% in a down year? What if you want to have some play money? Do you even need to hire an advisor to buy the S&P 500 ETF? Some people actually do, by the way. And your own emotions can affect this, right? So when I always talk about a growth bucket, the challenge isn't buying an S&P 500 fund or an ETF. The challenge is a diversification around the growth bucket. So how do we tackle this in our practice? How do we suggest you consider doing this? Well, build out your current rates of return or your typical rates of return. We use Nitrogen Wealth to figure it out for ourselves, potential growth, potential baselines, but figure out where you are, then figure out what your goals are, figure out what your financial plan says you can do, right? Sometimes you have to be honest with yourself saying, I can take more risk or I should take less risk. Start to build out some of your protection income buckets and then shove everything into growth and kind of get a sense of how does this look? How's this going to feel for you? And what I'm doing in my practice is I'm trying to figure out what is the rate of return supposed to be here? Is my client going to be happy if this event occurs or this event occurs? And, no one's happy when the market goes down, right? But some people can handle it better than others. And then you have to have this conversation around risk tolerance. And once you've kind of gone through this entire process, that's how you build out your growth bucket, in my opinion. And it's only supposed to be a component, right? This is different than general investing. This is part of retirement planning. So you have to look at your income buckets. You have to understand how your protection buckets are supposed to work. Your overall plan. Are you actually hitting overall good rates of return? Do you need to hire someone to help you do this, or can you do it yourself? Always watch out for taxes. And there's lots of other things to consider here. That's why someone like I exist. Doesn't mean you can't do this yourself. Absolutely, a lot of people can. In fact, I would argue most people do. But there's a lot, if you want to do this, what I would say is those are all little things you want to think about as you create your own growth bucket. I hope this is helpful. If you'd ever like to bug us, feel free to email us or call us in the future. We'd be happy to walk you through things. But at least I hope this gives you a good overview of how to look at a growth bucket for yourself. Thank you.